So let's begin with your 2 times great-grandmother. Have you ever asked yourself where she was at 7 years old in 1837? At school, possibly? Well, not quite. See, educational opportunities looked different back then. During this time, women education often focused on domestic and accomplishment skills. So instead, she was chained to embroidery, and I mean that in a very literal way. She could work on things like samplers and whitework with borders so cruelly complex they could reduce a child to tears. Now, what exactly were these? Well, a sampler was a square of linen, stitched with alphabets, numbers, and borders. They were essentially handcrafted pieces that proved a girl's discipline and patience. Meanwhile, whitework was embroidery with white thread on white fabric, and thus its tedious patterns were barely visible unless you looked closely. So, in short, together, these were lovely to look at, but also relentless in their demand for precision and patience, particularly for a primary school child. Wouldn't you say? See, they weren't just playing crafts. They were training in obedience, perseverance, and moral character. Now, is this a good or bad thing? Well, I'll let you be the judge of that. Here's where the phrase comes in, the tyrannous needle. Have you heard it? It didn't start as a joke. In fact, it was a genuine complaint. It was circulating in the 19th century when women began to write about the crushing hours lost to sewing. The needle became tyrannous because it ruled their time and their bodies, often resulting in sore eyes, cramped fingers from the endless repetition of work. For middle-class women, the work was about refinement and virtue, but for the working woman, it was sheer survival, sewing long hours for wages. Either way, the needle demanded submission. And so this was girlhood for much of the 18th century Enlightenment age and the 19th century's Victorian and Gilded periods. Patience, obedience, and neat stitches. This was considered moral training for future womanhood. In other words, the needle was the tyrant. Childhood wasn't only about hopscotch and ring around the roses. It was also about embroidery, boot camp. But then, by the late 19th century, things began to change. The modern girl escaped the tyranny of the needle. She was now rowing boats, riding bicycles, playing tennis in the garden, instead of Berlin woolwork, which was important during this period. Instead, she learned French, because in society, French wasn't an accomplishment anymore. It was social survival. Yet, as the author of Manners for Women points out, something else shifted too. Once freed from the discipline of the needle, the modern girl also began to dismiss the smaller acts of duty that once marked good upbringing. For example, let's take emotion, where her grandmother might have wept sentimentally at a wedding. She scoffed. The author calls it blubbing, which was a hot word during this time. But she also holds this up as evidence that the new girl prided herself on strength, refusing even the small courtesy of shared tears. Next, let's consider something even more practical, like beef tea. And no, this wasn't a soup. It was actually a thin broth of beef essence. It was a staple for invalids and older family members, very popular during this time. The author is deliberate in its use. She notes that the modern girl was too busy imagining herself as Florence Nightingale saving the empire, and forgets the most basic duty like bringing mother her medicine or her father's restorative beef tea. So yes, your great-great-grandmother, she wept over her sampler. Us, meaning you and I, we complain about the Wi-Fi. And that's the point. When Miss Humphrey writes in Manners for Women about samplers, blubbing, and beef tea, she isn't praising the modern girl's new freedoms. She's critiquing them, arguing that the escape from the tyrannous needle also meant a loss of patience, tenderness, and responsibility. After all, authors like Miss Humphrey saw the needle not as a pastime, but a small tyrant of girlhood. What was once a lady's duty had now become optional, and in Miss Humphrey's eyes, that was hardly progress.